Welcome back to Powered by Play. I'm Drew, and I'm a professor of theater at Chapman University in Southern California.
I'm Avery, and I'm a theatrical scenic designer. Every month on this podcast, we explore what we play, how we play, and why we play.
We believe play powers us, and that's what makes it powerful.
All right, Drew.
All right, Avery.
Press play. This month, we are discussing science and medicine. So, science covers practically everything: physics and nature, mathematics and computers, engineering and medicine, and countless more. No matter what age we are, we always want to know, how does this phenomenon work? And then figuring out those answers, whether it involves inventing games and telling stories, or gathering and analyzing empirical evidence, usually always involves forms of play. So we're here to talk about what those forms of play might look like and how they impact us overall.
Yes, and Avery, we have a special guest this month. So I would like to introduce Kristen Cruz. And Kristen, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you're excited about science and what you do?
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I have pretty much loved science since I was a little kid. My dad really liked exploring through science. And so he gave us growing up a lot of awesome opportunities to play around with the natural world. And I'm currently a high school teacher. I've taught at Fullerton High School for about 20 years. So I teach anatomy and physiology. I teach biology, AP biology. I taught earth science a long, long time ago. So, I just really love science and exploring.
Well, maybe we should start off by talking about what we played with when we were kids and how we played with science. So, when I was a kid, there were doctor play kits. Those were very, very early kinds of things. And usually there was a stethoscope and maybe a blood pressure cuff and a toy shot injection and a few other things that were meant to let a kid pretend that they were a doctor. And then there was also the classic game Operation, where you were trying to use these little tweezer type things to take tiny little things out of the person's body. And if you touched the side of the little depression where the thing that you were trying to remove was, it would go, "Eh," and the patient's nose would light up. It would be this cute little red light. I don't know why I found that fascinating, but I did. So I remember the commercial for that game said, "It takes a very steady hand." And so I always thought, oh, that's what a surgeon needs. That's what doctors need. And when I was a kid, I also would watch Mr. Wizard. So that's Gen X. That's going back, Gen X and before, actually. That's going back a long way. But he was a really cool kind of older guy. And I think he was on PBS, if I'm remembering correctly, and he would have kids help him do experiments. Then later on, when I was a little older and my sister was watching science stuff on TV, there was Bill Nye the Science Guy with his very natty bow tie, and he was kind of a worthy successor to Mr. Wizard. But besides that, my sister and I loved playing in the dirt in our backyard, just digging holes and filling them with water and seeing what we could find. There were also undeveloped spaces where I lived, and so I would take my bike. This is kind of like a very Stranger Things kind of, life. I would take my bike and go explore like places by the creek or places in these sort of hills that just had not been developed. That was fun. So in general, understanding mud and how mud worked, understanding plants and how they grew, looking for animals kinds of in these isopods or pill bugs. They were around a lot. And trying to figure out what kind of animals were around and what they were like. And then also differences between flowers and plants and weeds, very early on, and very early on, my dad taught us the difference between plants and flowers and weeds, and that weeds were not welcome in the garden. And so we were put to work weeding, and my goodness, those weeds loved to grow. So those are the kinds of things I remember when I was kind of playing with science and when I was learning about science. What about you, Avery?
I was a part of Girl Scouts growing up, and we did do a good amount of like weeding projects and nature cleanup things, like beach cleanup. I know that was a really big part of the environmental culture around where I grew up, especially just with in a pretty largely populated county. There were just going to be a lot of like little rivers or ocean aspects or parks that just had a lot of trash. So we always would go around and do that a lot. And at one point, we also weeded out a really big portion of this local park, and we cultivated it with butterfly plants so that we could regrow the butterfly population a bit. That was pretty interesting. Definitely a lot of those class documentaries growing up in schools as well. Bill Nye, of course. I haven't heard of Mr. Wizard though, so that's pretty interesting. And Mythbusters was also a very fun part of science and experimentation because they were always about playfully but also scientifically exploring why things work the way they do and how we can figure that out with their own experiments, hypotheses, and tests. And usually something would explode, so that would also contribute to the entertainment factor too. I think one of my most favored ones of their series was when they were busting these Hollywood myths of well, in like cartoons, you know how if there's like a table set with dishes and plates and stuff, and there's a tablecloth underneath it, the myth is that you can whip out the tablecloth fast enough so that the stuff on the table is still completely still and doesn't break at all. I think they tested it with like different motorcycles and vehicles to see how much speed they would have to do that, and it was very intense and cool. And just busting other myths from like the movies about can you escape a car that's fallen underwater. And I thought that was really interesting because it kind of went to show that the stuff that you see on TV or in the movies are not necessarily scientifically accurate. And so this was a very important form of media that Mythbusters created that was educational and also playing along with those media myths that you might see around. And then, speaking of science teachers, the Magic School Bus was my favorite show growing up, or one of them, and just the 1994 to 97 one. I haven't seen the new remake, but I haven't heard great, amazing things about it, but I'm very impartial to the original. And Miss Frizzle was a very adventurous, but also usually she maintained safety kind of teacher. Her catchphrases were always like seatbelts, everyone, and then she would do something absolutely dangerous and she single file please or double file please, and just contrasted with diving into volcanoes and surfing lava trails and stuff like that. But also her outfit was always on theme as well, just whatever the topic of the day was, she just happened to be wearing the most cool cute outfit with like band-aids on it if they were doing like a medical episode. And of course, her famous catchphrase of take chances, make mistakes, and get messy. And I think that's a really perfect representation of what science is about when we play with it. And she also always says, like, good question. There's only one way to find out. And excellent observation. So she was very affirming of the kids' questions and their observations, which is what a good teacher or mentor should be when kids are being very curious. Because a lot of the episodes would start with students saying like, well, why does this work the way that this works? Or why do I have to take medicine for when I'm sick? And then she's like, whoa, cool question. Let's dive deep into it, figure out exactly why so that you have all the answers that you might need from a empirical perspective. And this was also an example of experiential learning. Even though it got dangerous a lot of times, they would almost get eaten by squids or, eaten by other humans or whatever, or frozen in space. And there was just always a lot of danger. But at the end of the day, she kept them safe and they would always learn something new at the end of the day. So that was a very wonderful kids show to dive back into for this episode.
I think I have a lot of similar experiences hearing both of you talk. So, Drew, when you were talking about Dr. Play kits, something that just popped into my mind is my sister and I would drive my mom crazy because we would use so much toilet paper and get it wet to make casts. So, that was the thing you did when you were a kid. You would wrap all of the toilet paper around your arm and pretend like you had a cast. And that just brought back that memory for me. So even more than Dr. Play kits, we loved doing the cast making. And then Avery, when you were talking about Mythbusters, that reminded me of an episode that I was watching where they were using the breakable glass. And that reminded me of my childhood because my dad would do really cool and kind of Miss Frizzle style, probably definitely unsafe things with us looking back. Um, he made us breakable glass. So I don't know where he made it, how he got it, but I remember he came home and my sister and my friends and I had these glass bottles that weren't really glass that we would hit each other over the head with
Oh
and
my
have them
gosh!
break. And that was a lot of fun. My dad was a firefighter growing up, and I don't think he knew this particular thing that we would do, but we would go it was yeah, not something that he would probably be happy with, although firefighters are big pyromaniacs, that comes with the job. But we would go, my friends and I, into our garage that had like a linoleum floor, and we would put rubbing alcohol or like hand sanitizer on the floor and we would write our name in hand sanitizer or rubbing alcohol and light it on fire. So that was something I just popped into my mind that I'm sure he would not like to hear. He also took us to some place called Mud Park. I think it's actually Adventure Playground, but that reminds me of Drew talking about playing in the mud. There is this amazing place in Huntington Beach, California, where you can wade through like it's a little man-made lake swampy area and it's just mud and you play on Tom Sawyer style rafts in a mud pit. They give you nails and you can build clubhouses. So if you pick up a piece of trash, you can trade that in for like 4 nails and they give little kids saws and nails and you climb on these rickety structures and build playhouses. So that was something that we would go to pretty frequently when I was a kid. And that was a way to explore with getting dirty and I guess physics and construction as we were sawing and hammering. And it's still around. So you can still go there. I also loved potion making when I was a kid. So you would find the little jars and figure out, oh, if I crush up this berry, what color is it going to turn? So that was a really fun, formative experience when I was a kid. Something else that goes into the probably not so safe is my dad got his hands on liquid nitrogen. And if you know what that is, it's very similar to dry ice, but it's in liquid form and it is freezing liquids. And my dad did amazing Halloween. Like if you came to our house on Halloween, he went mad scientist and had
Oh my
all these
gosh.
really cool things going on. So it was kind of like a haunted house, but instead of haunted house, there were tons of experiments, potions bubbling in the windows. And he'd always buy liquid nitrogen to make smoke and fog. And he left us to play with liquid nitrogen. And so we would crack eggs in liquid nitrogen and it instantly freezes. So then you can take a slotted spoon and you scoop an egg out that's just like a frozen egg. It looks like it's a cooked fried egg. And we would take balloons and you dip balloons in the liquid nitrogen. And then when you touch them, they shatter. Remember, we dipped roses into liquid nitrogen. And that was so much fun because we just experimented. What are all the things that we can dip into this really harmful liquid that he did tell us you need to be careful. You can't put your hands in there. You can't touch it. This is what they use to like freeze warts off of people when you go into the doctor's office. But then he let, a bunch of early high schoolers play around with liquid nitrogen, and he likes to tell the story of how he went to bed, and then when he came in the morning the next day, that there were just thawed eggs and all sorts of thawed food just on the floor because we just didn't clean it up. And yeah, that was a really awesome experience that I think helped to explore the creativity in terms of applying it to science that has stuck with me for life.
Oh man, what a childhood, Kristen. I love the idea that we're starting to talk a little bit about here with danger and dangerous science and science safety. That's something that we can probably track as we go through. The next thing that I wanted to chat about is plants and animals, and we started talking about them a little bit. So as we grow up, we encounter more and more plants. We go outside our backyard and notice that there are a whole bunch of different trees. We understand that there are animals that may not be what we've seen at home. And so we start exploring the world, and plants and animals are a big part of kind of the science that we encounter. I love this Thoreau quote. I had to read Walden when I was in high school, and for some reason that book has always stuck with me. This is one of his more famous quotes, but I love it. He said, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. And I've always loved the idea of living deliberately, like not just posting, not just kind of sleepwalking, looking around you, being curious, being excited, and thinking about what it actually takes to live. And so plants and animals are a part of what you're noticing when you're out there. I will start by talking about our pets that we have in my house. So we actually literally have a little sign in our house that says there's like a lot of animals in here. And we have 2 dogs, 1 cat, 2 tortoises, and 1 fish. And so we have the kind of confederation of mammals, and then we have the reptile group and 1 aquatic group. So I have been watching as we added our cat to this group, to this little menagerie. I have watched to see how the cat and the dogs have interacted. And mostly 1 dog has interacted, our younger dog, our more energetic dog. One of the things that I have been excited to see is that our new cat, whose name is Fern, has taught our dog, whose name is Chiaro, short for Chiaroscuro, how to play like a cat and how to stalk. And so Chiaro did not do this before Fern was added to the house, but he now gets down almost on his belly and crawls just like he's trying to stalk something. Normally, dogs would signal that they want to play, or they would play by biting the other animal's neck in a playful way. Richard Schechner talks about this as a nip, not a bite. Like, I am not trying to harm you. I am trying to signal you that I want to play. But the cat plays by reaching out her paw and booping the dog on its nose. And it's a completely different style of play. But she's teaching Chiaro how to do this. She also plays with bugs. And I know those of you who have cats and love cats are familiar with the whole cat, like catch and release, and then catch again, and then release again, like the common phrase of the cat toying with the mice or toying with its prey. And it's fascinating to see, like, Fern, why don't you just, if you want to actually eat the bug, why don't you just kill it the first time? But there's this playful nature to a cat that I want to keep it alive, let it see if it can escape, and then let it know that it can't escape. So pretty fascinating. Also, petting mammals is a very different experience than petting the tortoises. So the mammals have this, they're obviously warm-blooded, they have fur, they're soft. The tortoises have this cold shell, but you can still kind of like stroke the shell, and the animal, the tortoise, will feel that you are interacting with it and feel sort of comforted by that. In terms of plants, okay, you two, I will full on admit that I am not the best plant person in the entire world. I had trouble keeping houseplants alive. I had this little violet flower plant that my grandmother gave me when I was in college. And because my grandmother had given it to me, I worked really hard to try to keep that plant alive. And I did for a long time, but that was interesting. I also see houseplants in pots that are decorated, and that kind of like gives the plant a personality. So that's kind of fun. I love when that happens. But plants and animals, I love arboretums. I Whenever I go to a new place, a new country, a new kind of like environment, I always notice the plants very quickly and how they are different, how they are unique, how they're reflective of the place where I am. So, plants and animals have been a really fascinating way to notice the science around me. How about you, Avery?
It's really fun that all kinds of animals engage in play in addition to humans, like dolphins, horses, octopuses, elephants, sheep, hippos, ravens, foxes, even bees. Like, I saw a video this week of a little bee just pushing around some wooden beads around just because it was just having fun and playing with it. And so it makes sense that it's only fitting that we also, as a species, enjoy playing with other species to learn more about them. It's also fun when you collect knowledge about how to play with different animals too. I did work with therapy horses a bit as a high schooler, just volunteering with them. And so I did spend a lot of time learning their body language and how to navigate around them because they're big and they're big and prey animals. So if you do something that makes them react in a bad way, it could get you hurt or somebody else hurt just because they've just got big little hooves and they're just big creatures. I recently went to visit it was like a petting zoo farm kind of situation. It's a local one in town. And for the past year, I've only been playing with dogs and cats, so I haven't really interacted with horses for a while. And they had some mini horses and like mini donkeys at this little zoo. I went up to these cute little donkeys, and the employees were like, "Oh, yeah, you want to pet him? Yeah, come here." And I held my hand out under its nose because I was like, "Yeah, it's gonna sniff me because that's what you do with dogs, Avery. It's not a dog." And I forgot that that's kind of where, oh, they probably thought I was holding food. So the donkey just kind of chomped on my hand. It did not sniff me, I learned. And after I felt that bit of pain, I was like, "Oh, right. I should have kind of went up to stroke its kind of forehead a little bit rather than putting my hand out under its mouth." And so that was just like a fun little time where I got chomped by a donkey recently. On the topic of houseplants, yeah, Drew, I'm with you. I'm not really much of a caretaker of them. I think even people are always like in California, they're like, "Oh, start with a cactus because it doesn't really need much." And yeah, no, I kill the cactus, so at least I get to play board games with plants instead of real plants. There's one called Mycelium, a mushling game that I've played with my siblings. It came out in the past few years, and your goal is to expand your network of mycelium pathways to be the first player to gather 10 nutrients. And you just have like this little team of little mushrooms, and you kind of connect yourselves and connect paths so that you can get these trees to have nutrients. And that was like a really cute way to play with the theme of mushrooms and connection and how you kind of keep respawning yourself and making more spores and connections and offspring. Another game that I love about animals is Wingspan. It's grown a lot in popularity, and now they have tons of expansion packs. But basically, you are a bird enthusiast, like you're a researcher or a bird watcher or an ornithologist or a collector, and you're basically seeking to discover and attract the best birds to your network of wildlife preserves. So I really liked the premise of this game because it's not really about capturing like with Pokemon, you're supposed to capture and train Pokemon and then raise them to fight each other and then you profit off of that. But with Wingspan, it's you're like inviting birds to your preserve. You basically are the one who is setting up the habitat for them. If you want to set it up in the forest plain or the forest environment or the plain environment or the water environment, you set up the nest for them so that they want to come to you. And then when they do come to you, they're just kind of like visitors in your little abode, and they get you some more bonuses, and you can get more points, and you can get more points when you have them lay more eggs. But it's also not a uh, it's not a very colonialist game. I think that could be a theme with a lot of animal collection games where the goal is just to have more and more. And yeah, sure, the Wingspan theme is that you do want to collect more birds, but there are so many varieties of birds that there are multiple ways to win the game. And then every time you play the game, there's different parameters that you can win at. So you can have like all these small birds, you can have big ones, you can have carnivorous ones, you can have berry eating ones. And it's not really about, getting the biggest, prettiest ones. It tells you and teaches you that there's so many beautiful things about every single different bird species. And every card also has facts about each bird, and it's all based on reality. And so it's a really wonderful way to play with birds without actually having to be with birds themselves, that you're still able to explore this interest around them and from the comfort of your own home.
All right. Well, I am actually not a bird person. I had to take an ornithology class in college, and
Mm.
it was one of the classes. It was just not my favorite. One of the things that we had to do was we had a practicum. That's the name of a lot of science tests where it's like a laboratory practical test. And we had to memorize bird calls. And there was like
Ooh.
200 bird calls we had to remember. And they would just, play a little recording and you would have to write down like, "Oh, this is a chickadee," or something. But the thing that I do now appreciate after having had that class and suffered through it at the time is, "Oh, that's a California quail. I hear that bird," or, "Oh, I hear that towhee in my backyard. Where is it?" So, something that I really hated at the time, now, when I'm going out walking around the neighborhood, I always see, "Oh, I remember, that's the black phoebe there," and just pulling up these things that are just hidden in the recesses of my brain. So, I love hunting for bugs, which is kind of funny since I am, 40 something years old. And I look forward to every year when I start my AP biology class. One of the labs that I have students do is they set up these choice chambers with roly polies where they do an experiment and they have to do statistics on figuring out which chambers roly-polies prefer. So I have to go and collect about 100 roly-polies. So it has been the start of my roly-poly hunting season. And for the past 3 weeks, whenever I go on my walks, we have really nice trails around where I live. I walk with a little baggie. And I just see a roly-poly walking across and scoop it up and put it in, and I can tell you all of the little spots around my neighborhood where I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I'm gonna find a whole bunch of roly-polies here." I know the places at my work, on my high school campus where, okay, this is the good spot to get the roly-polies, and I am so content to just crouch down with a spoon, which both my husband and my person that I share a lab with at work probably don't appreciate because they come home and there is like a muddy, warped spoon sitting in the sink from me digging through the dirt. Um, but I think that just like exploring, and it's so calming to just kind of be one with nature and just kind of hunter gatherer, pick through and find these things. I also love going to the tide pools, and my kids used to like it, but now dragging them along, they're like, "Really? Do we have to pick through the rocks at the beach again?" But I could probably go once a week and not get bored of digging through the tide pools and finding sea anemones. And there are some really cool citizen science things that can be done with plants and animals. One of those things is my kids and I and some of my work colleagues went and were trying to find abalone shells. And there's a research project where We take pictures of abalone shells when we find them, and you record what species of abalone they are, and you look for shucking marks to see if someone illegally caught the abalone. You measure how long it is, and then you send the information into a local researcher who uses that in her research for projects for different beaches along Southern California. So it's a way to explore and be part of science with helping out researchers that you have never met, just contributing to a database. Something else that's really cool with citizen science, where you can, like, if you log in and just type in citizen science, all these science projects pop up. But there is wildlife cameras that are kind of like gaming, I think, because you can look at pictures from wildlife cameras and you can help to ID animals. So one thing that I've done before, and I've actually had my students do, is look at wildlife cameras in the Serengeti and go through and help to ID what kind of animals are popping up whenever the camera gets tripped. And it helps to research what's available and around, and looking at declining populations and how populations change over different seasons. And there's a whole bunch of people that are out and helping to do this research that couldn't be done with just limited people working on the project. So I really like the idea that by doing something that's kind of like play, you can help research and look at wildlife cameras. And that's something really fun. iNaturalist, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that website, but it's an app that you can download where you can take pictures of plants and animals when you're out and about. I just opened up it right now and saw a bunch of people have taken pictures and uploaded it of just in, a couple blocks of where we're sitting right now. So that's kind of like gamifying in a way, because you can look at people and see their profiles and how many plants and animals they've ID'd. And it's another way to kind of play with plants and animals out in nature. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents for plants and animals.
That's amazing. That's really cool.
Kristen, I have a question for you about dissection as part of a bio class, AP Bio, or other kinds of things, because this has been something that has been kind of an ethical question for years and years and years. I mean, even before us, people were wondering, should dissection be a part of a biology class? And what happens when you have a kid who wants to opt out? So these days, what do you guys do? What creatures do you dissect? Has it shifted from an actual physical animal to digital stuff? And I know that my daughter, when she was in your class, did not want to dissect something. So how are bio teachers thinking about that nowadays?
I actually don't dissect a whole lot in my biology classes. So we start off the year doing a squid dissection. And in my biology class, that's all we dissect is a squid. And I actually haven't had very many students. I can't think of the last time I've had a student have an issue about dissecting a squid. But I also have students working in groups. And so I ask them to find a group where one person is okay with doing it, and not everybody has to actually do the dissecting. But there are also, if I have students absent, I have virtual things that I've set up to kind of help with that. So I personally would not require someone to do it. I would come up with an alternative. In my anatomy class, because it's anatomy, we do more dissections in that class. We actually used to do cats, and the cats came from animal shelters, so they were the cats that were euthanized anyways. So for me personally, I was okay with it because they're not alive anyways. So that was easier for me. And I did have a couple students that opted out of that, but then a lot of them ended up opting back in. I haven't really loved the digital alternatives because a lot of them are expensive. So you have to like buy a subscription. And so sometimes that can be prohibitive. But I haven't actually looked at what options exist in a couple years because I haven't had students opting out. We also have switched to a program called Anatomy and Clay instead of dissecting cats. So now it's been, gosh, probably 7 years since I've done that in my anatomy class. So instead of doing the dissection, we use clay and we have like skeleton models, like scale 3-foot skeleton models. And so students actually build in clay the organs onto the skeleton. And I feel like I myself learned a lot more when I did that, and I feel like students actually learn a lot more making the switch from dissecting cats to going into doing the clay building process. A lot of times with dissection, if you're not an expert and haven't been trained, it's really hard to find stuff because it's like a mushy mess. And so there's one of me running around trying to help students. Muscles especially is really challenging because they're covered in fascia. They stick together. So like to tease them apart and find where something is, it's challenging. So I really like doing the clay building instead. And that's kind of transformed my class and gotten rid of the ethical issues. I still do dissect hearts. So students can opt out of doing a heart dissection. I get them usually from like a butcher or a carniceria. So they're the byproducts of what was already being used for another purpose. And I like that better than doing a whole organism. I've done something called pluck, which sounds gross, just like it is, which is again more byproducts from the meat industry. So I have some actually sitting in a tub that one of the local colleges just said, "Hey, do you want this free donation of pluck?" And I jumped on the chance because what anatomy teacher wouldn't want free dissection stuff? But it's basically like trachea and liver and lungs just stuck together. So that again is more of a byproduct. So if it's like an ethical opposition, that might be a little bit easier for students. But I haven't had a lot of students that have issues ethically and would, by law, be required to work with them if they do. I'm pretty sure that's by law. I haven't looked into it in a while, but if not, I don't think it makes sense to force anyone to do anything that they're not comfortable with. They're not going to get anything out of the experience. So I don't believe that anyone should be required to do something like that. My cousin actually is a doctor now, and she did not do any dissections in high school, and she didn't do any dissections until she did a human cadaver in medical school because she had ethical opposition, and she made it through medical school. She's a doctor, so I don't really see the need to force someone to go against something that's part of their values. It's a really long answer for you.
That's really interesting to kind of know where schools are right now. And
That's also just me, and I myself am a vegetarian, so I might come across it from a different standpoint. I don't have problems with dissecting myself. Like I've done a ton of dissections. I didn't opt out of it, but I do see why students might have an issue. So I am probably more understanding than some other people would be at our school. I know my other colleagues do frogs as well, but I personally think frogs are gross. I love frogs, the living animal, but the dead frog, they've got these things called fatty bodies, and they're like squishy, and they they're sticky and they stick to your gloves when you're dissecting, and then students turn in papers, and then the papers are like stuck together, and it's because it's gummed together from fatty body gunk. So I just don't dissect frogs because I think that their innards are a little gross.
oh my gosh. Okay, let's go from dissection. Let's go back to the ocean, shall we? And talk a little bit about water and earth and sandcastles. I still love making sandcastles and all kinds of different techniques, whether it's dribbling them or whether it's using shells or pieces of driftwood to kind of help support the sand. I mean, it's so fun to just like the clay organs, use this pliable stuff that you have in front of you and just create these wonderful buildings with it. And then sometimes watch the ocean wash them away. Or sometimes think, you know what? I really don't want that tower in that place. I'm going to knock out that tower and put it somewhere else. So, playing in miniature with making these grand structures is super fun. And speaking of water and earth, mud. I mean, mud soaks are still a big thing in spas. And it strikes me that going all the way back to when we were playing in the mud as kids and just putting mud on our faces or getting immersed in a mud bath is almost like a little bit of return to childhood, a little bit of return to, well, I mean, we all started floating in water in the womb, right? And so that's kind of maybe taking us back to a period of comfort. I know none of us remember it, but taking us back to a period of comfort or safety. And I think, hot springs are very similar. The warm water soaking and a really good hot spring, just watching the steam rise, and even just being in the jacuzzi and watching the steam rise around us, feeling the cold air around us and the warm water is a very comforting kind of thing, a very playful, meditative sort of experience. Pools, swimming pools, water parks, lazy rivers, slides, whether you're in an inner tube or you're just, on your own with your body in a water slide. Feeling water all around you is kind of special. And controlling water and being able to put our heads out of water and not being fully immersed in it to where we would be at the mercy of a lack of oxygen that we could breathe is pretty enjoyable. It's a chance to get into something that's all around us, but that we don't kind of have as part of our daily lives because, well, hey, we would be wet and we don't want to walk around wet all the time. But it's really cool to learn about the physics of what water does. And I remember back in my chemistry class all the ways that water was a special and a unique compound, and it had all these really interesting special properties. One of them I know was water tension, where that's why a bug could walk on water. I still remember, okay, going back, so my high school chemistry teacher, Mr. Gifford, man, I remember he was an interesting guy. He had a chalkboard and he would always get chalk all over his fingers, and so he would sort of wipe his fingers on his shirt, and he would have chalk all over his shirt, and that in itself was a little bit of a chemistry lesson. But man, there was nothing he loved more than water, and how fascinated that man could make water sound fascinating. And so just playing with it, because it is all around us and it does have these special properties, is a way to just kind of learn about physics and chemistry together.
Yeah, when you mentioned the steaming water places, that reminded me of this hot springs mountain in Utah that I visited once. There was like some pools with the hot water, then there were some bathtubs that just were placed around the edge, not the edge of a cliff, but kind of just edge of the mountain, and you could just sit in the bathtub with the spring water and it would be warm and salty and you can just look over the sunset, and it was just a really beautiful moment. I remember the sun rays still catching the cotton or dust in the air or something. It was a very golden, lovely moment. But you also reminded me of, like, with swimming together, reminds me of all the social aspects of going swimming, because as a non-binary person, I think it's always just like the gender of the swimming clothes was always something that I was thinking about and wondering, what kind of swimming clothes I would want to wear, because it's a pretty vulnerable space to be in, with the way that we kind of dress ourselves when we play in the water with other people, and just kind of in the same way that playing with food, as we talked in a previous episode, can be a symbol of communal connection and extension of friendship. I think swimming in a pool is also similarly symbolic too, which reminds me of that one Mr. Rogers episode from 1969 where it was a hot day and he invited Officer Clemens, who was a black police officer played by Francois Clemens. Mr. Rogers invited him to cool off his feet in a children's wading pool. And then they also shared a towel after to wipe off the water. And during such a huge racially tense era of United States history, the fact that this episode aired on TV displaying this message of allyship and willing to connect with a black person during a time where it was not legal for black people and white people to swim in the same pools, let alone share towels. It was just a very symbolic gesture, and always is it goes down in history on, that kind of Mr. Rogers' legacy of what he kind of did for a playful attitude toward maintaining friendships and connecting with other people, regardless of their backgrounds or what they look like. With the theme of playing with water and the earth, I mean, the joy of digging a hole at the beach is just unmatched. And I also have seen internet videos of when you dig a hole that's too big, and then security comes up to you and tells you that you need to stop because it's a hazard. And I just think it's just funny because, I mean, we're at the beach. We really want to do this. Like, it's just in our brains that we really just want to dig a big hole. And yeah, it can be dangerous though, so probably should listen to the security people. But also pushing boulders and rocks off of cliffs into water without people below them, of course, or other creatures below them, but kind of seeing what a rock does when it flies into the water at a high speed or a tall height is always very fascinating that anybody of any age can enjoy. There's also the game Abzu, which I have mentioned on our Playing Monster episode. It's a 3D exploration game without any dialogue, and you are a humanoid kind of diver alien thing in the future-ish, and you're basically just swimming around through all these different water environments, interacting with all these different fish of all kinds. And you meet this great white shark, and it starts out to be really terrifying because you're like, whoa, it's a shark. Sharks are supposed to be, they represent evil, they represent danger in society. Like sharks, I read in a book recently that sharks are one of the most feared things in the world. And the fact that this game kind of led you to kind of becoming an ally with a shark, but also seeing other scary creatures and just kind of being like, oh, okay, they're not super gonna bother me. They're just trying to live their own lives. That being able to immerse yourself in this beautiful world of water with strange and bizarre and dangerous looking creatures that you can learn their scientific names and learn their different colors and even ride along with them, is that it kind of bridges that gap of the unknown. And I think that's what science and exploration is all about, especially when we include it in our games.
Speaking about sharks, I know a lot of people are terrified of sharks. I love sharks. We had the opportunity a few years ago to go cage diving with sharks. So my husband and my son, who like sharks, went. My daughter, who is terrified of them, did not go with us. But we were in Oahu in Hawaii, and we got into cages, and there were a lot of Galapagos sharks that were swimming by. And I was kind of upset we had to be in a cage because the Galapagos sharks they're not the sharks that bite you. So I was like, wait, what? These sharks aren't scary? Why are we in a cage? Why can't we just be swimming free with these Galapagos sharks? And it was such a cool experience. We also recently this year had the opportunity to go and do a night manta ray experience. So that was
Whoa.
amazing. That was on the big island of Hawaii. And they take you out in the pitch black in the middle, not middle of the night, but I think we did it at 10 o'clock at night. And they have one place in the world where the manta rays are pretty much guaranteed to be seen every night, and they hunt for krill. So these are large rays. They're not stingrays. They don't have stingers, so they can't sting you. But they can be about 17 feet long. They're giant creatures, and they eat krill. And what they do to attract them at night is they have paddle boards that are equipped with like UV lights all around them to attract the krill up to the paddle board. And you just hang on to these little grips that they put around the paddle board. So I think there's like 6 to 8 people who are hanging on to one paddle board and just floating. And you have on your snorkeling mask, and you just sit there for about half an hour and just watch as these giant creatures just come up and barrel roll right inches away from your face as they're catching the krill. And it is such an amazing experience. So I love doing things like that. Snorkeling is one of my favorite activities, but I'm also someone who hates cold water. So I've very rarely gone off the California coast because it's too cold to snorkel. But on rare days, one of my friends swims in the ocean all the time. And on rare days, she will say, okay, it's a really good visibility day. So I will go in the water despite it being freezing to look for Garibaldi. But I love interacting with ocean in terms of, again, it kind of reminds me of like bug hunts. You're looking for something and exploring someplace you don't get to see very often.
That reminds me of a time I went snorkeling in middle school at a science camp. It was on Catalina Island, I believe, and I was panicked the heck out from the seaweed wrapping around my legs, and kept being the slowest person in the group because I was just hyperventilating, just like grossed out by the seaweed. And it took me, I think, that until the next day or something, that I just slowed down and was like, okay, let's take a deep underwater mental breath. And I mean, snorkels, I'm just kidding. But let's take a deep breath of air, and let's look at the seaweed. What is it? I mean, it's just like it's plant. It's just really long. It's kind of like my hair. I mean, my hair is really long and it kind of does stuff underwater. Oh, right. It's actually pretty. It's really pretty, actually. Like, wow, look how pretty the seaweed is. It just flows with the water. It's gorgeous. It's actually really cool. And that was the moment that I was able to swim regularly again and not panic.
Those kelp forests, I think they just make you feel so small because when you're looking at the kelp forests here off the coast of California and Catalina, I think it really reminds you of how deep the ocean goes because you see that line just trailing down, and then all of a sudden you can't see it anymore and you're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, okay. We're out here. What is in that area that I can't see?" And I think the kelp forests specifically remind you of that. If you're somewhere like
Yeah.
tropical, "Oh, okay, I can see to the bottom. There's nothing lurking that I can't see." I think it's kind of the unknown, the mystery
Mm.
of your mind, you can imagine all of these things down there just coming out to get you. That's a little bit terrifying. With both of you guys talking about liking digging tunnels, I remember one of my favorite things at the beach was to dig the two separate holes, like the small holes, and then you would dig between them to connect them to make the bridge in between the two tunnels and seeing how far you could go before your bridge would collapse. That was one of my favorite things, digging in the earth. And I also think that animals love to explore water because I think, Drew, you were talking about meditating and like water being meditative. And it is definitely that for one of my cats. He is obsessed with the bathtub and he wants to just sit and watch water go down the drain. So he could sit there for hours. So I have to set like a timer. Okay, you get 2 minutes of me letting the water drip so you can stare at it. But I think just water is so mesmerizing for seems like lots of different animals. I also connected to Drew talking about his science teacher being amazed by water and being able to make it sound fascinating. That reminds me of a lab that I have my students do when we talk about investigating the properties of water. And looking at surface tension, where you see how many drops of water can fit on a penny with just the surface tension. And then you add a little bit of soap and do it again, and the soap breaks the surface tension. So you can explore, how do different liquids compare to water, or adding things to water? How does it change the surface tension and how many drops you can fit on a penny? You can also do those, I don't know if you've seen those experiments where you have paper towels, and you take a paper towel and you take a couple different like beakers or just containers of water, and you put food coloring in them, and you arc paper towels so they make like a snake of, a paper towel in red goes into the paper towel in yellow, the paper towel in yellow goes into the paper towel in blue. And then as the water climbs up the paper towel, you get a rainbow effect where the red pulls up on one side of one paper towel and the yellow pulls up on the other, and then it's orange in the middle. So there's a lot of really fun experiments when you go into a florist and you see some of the
Oh,
carnations
yeah.
that have the edges that are colored. There you go. That's exploring water and experimentation and surface tension. So there's a lot of fascinating things to be done with water.
I was just thinking about carnations. Right when you said that, I thought, okay, if Kristen doesn't talk about carnations, I'm going to talk about carnations. Yeah, the fascinating way that you can, if you track it, you can see slowly the water make it up and bring the color into that flower. Well, from the ocean to the sky, how about space exploration? So when I was a kid, it was the sort of heyday of the space shuttle program. So the US had sort of stopped sending expeditions to the moon, but the space shuttle was sort of the newest, coolest thing. And we learned about how the space shuttle worked, what kind of experiments were going on. And then, of course, we had the tragic Challenger disaster where Kristen McAuliffe, who was a teacher, was she perished with the other folks in that disaster. And that sort of put the space program back a little bit. And we started thinking, okay, what are we getting out of this? But I remember spaceships being fascinating. So I went from Lego spaceships, building Lego spaceships, and sort of having a little rivalry with my friends about who could build the coolest spaceship. And what would this Lego spaceship be able to do? Would it have a little grabby hand that could pick up rocks from planets? Would it have lasers that could defend it against an asteroid that was coming at it, or a space pirate? And yes, I full on admit that I still build Lego spaceships. I mean, they are just the best thing. And different parts of our houses were different planets. So a table would be this planet that had this particular properties. And maybe the staircase in my friend's house would be this particular planet that had this, I don't know, waterfall or lava fall or something like that. And I think we were very influenced by Star Wars and Star Trek, especially Star Trek, and how each planet was different and they encountered something. And it was really fascinating because whatever episode was going on was usually a completely different ecosystem and social system. So the idea of exploration and in the original series, it was the 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, seek out new life and new civilizations, boldly go where no one had gone before, and that really resonated, I think, for a lot of us who were alive during that part of NASA and what was happening with the shuttle system. And I think because I love science fiction, am still influenced by Star Wars and Star Trek, interesting aliens, otherworldly landscapes, and how each planet looks different, and all kinds of things that could not exist here on Earth, but could exist on other planets. And I had the wonderful good fortune when I was an undergrad at UC San Diego of taking the physics of space exploration with Sally Ride. And so Sally Ride, who is no longer with us, amazing, amazing teacher, amazing human being. and listening to her tell stories. So, for our listeners who don't know, she was the first American woman in space, and she led the charge for women to be included in science. And she was a fascinating sort of role model for women and for girls who thought I could do that, right? And away from, because we had all kinds of fictional representations, but she was a woman who in real life was there with the guys on that spacecraft doing these amazing things. So listening to Professor Ride tell the stories about what it was like to be weightless, what it was like to try and move from one part of the space shuttle to another. And I think there's this sense of what it would be like. We here on Earth, like when we get in a pool, we think, oh, this is kind of like being weightless. And so hearing from someone who actually had been in that other world and had escaped the bonds of gravity and all the stuff that happens on Earth, just hearing those stories was enough to keep me invested in, oh man, I'm going to keep following what NASA is doing. I'm going to keep following sort of stories about how space is useful, all kinds of science fiction about how we keep reaching for the stars. And okay, Avery, so one of my favorite board games is Roll for the Galaxy, which is part of the Race for the Galaxy and Jump Drive and Roll for the Galaxy. It's part of this whole series by one of my favorite designers, Tom Lehman. And you are essentially building a space empire. And so you have developments and worlds that you kind of bring under your control. And you gather resources and you rise in technology and all these kinds of things. You start from very humble beginnings. One planet is under your control, one technological development is under your control, and from there you bring more and more and more into your space empire. And so it's a process of building. It's not about attacking the other player. It is, as the name suggests, a race to make sure that you can use your resources effectively and take care of your planets and take care of your developments. So I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to one of my favorite board games.
I remember when I was in kindergarten, that was when the Challenger exploded. So that's one of my first memories of space is that Challenger explosion. And I remember all of us kindergartners sitting on one of the little like rolly cart TVs watching it. And just it seems like nobody knows what to do in that time. But I was a kid, so I didn't really realize what was happening until looking back on it. It's one of the formative memories when you think back of, oh, where were you when this happened? I can totally have one of those like flashbulb memories where I can see everything in my periphery for, just like a short snapshot that seems very clear in my mind. And I actually went to a middle school that was called McAuliffe Middle School, which was in a different place from where my kindergarten experience was. But that was my first experience, I guess, with space and astronomy. I think it's really fascinating what social media and apps are doing with helping to expose people to something that is off limits for a lot of people. So one of the really cool apps is Night Sky that can help you to point your phone at the stars and it tells you about what you're looking at. So there's a lot of apps like that. It's hard for us being in Southern California with all the light pollution to actually see what's going on. So you can hold up your phone and, oh, there actually is things there, even though I can't really see them. But that's one of the nice things when you get to somewhere where it is dark to actually be able to see the stars. I also think it's really fascinating with social media and being able to stream what the astronauts are doing on the International Space Station. I remember watching astronaut Chris Hadfield as he sang Bowie's Space Oddity in space. And that was just such a cool thing to see as he's weightless singing this song. I also have watched on, TikTok or Instagram or whatever, some of the astronauts who just share some of the daily life things that you wouldn't think about, like how do I drink coffee in space? Or I remember one that was really fascinating was one of the female astronauts sharing how she washes her long hair in space. And you just see this mass of hair floating with like liquid fluid but stuck to the hair, and how she has to wring it out and you have to catch all that hair or all that water so it can be reused. So I think that's kind of fascinating how we are more have an idea of what's going on up there because we can feel like we're a part of it with social media.
Fascinating. One of the video games about space that I've played a lot has been No Man's Sky, which is a 3D third person kind of exploration and survival computer game. It's on, a lot of platforms from 2016 release date. It's science fiction, and every single thing in the game mostly is procedurally generated. So that means that each planet, each creature, ship, multi-tool, and other items are they're all created using algorithms in the game itself. And this makes every single part of the game have a ton of diversity, and you get to build your own bases on different gorgeous planets. And like the amount of times that I've just landed on a new planet and then just looked around as my character and just go, wow, this is gorgeous, with like purple grass, green mountains, and in the sky there's multiple planets, and some of them are aligned, some of them are larger, some of them are way in the distance. And the more that you build up your ship, the more that you're able to just travel around this galaxy all by yourself, and it feels like you're just completely alone, even though there are tons of other people also playing the game at the same time. And just being able to explore and travel around, and you can even name the different species that you discover. I think I came up with such strange names like Bob Gop, or just the weirdest names that you could do and come up with. I mean, the whole galaxy is yours. Another game, Astroneer, is an independent kind of adaptation, not adaptation, but it's kind of an indie space exploration, crafting, and survival thing as well. And it's a lot more of a cuter aesthetic and more kind of a little bit smaller, but you're still able to play with your friends and explore space from your little astronaut body. And both these games utilize resource systems reliant on elements, such as using carbon, oxygen, ferrite dust, magnetized ferrite, silicate powder, and sodium. Like you just shoot, you have like a little gun, but like your gun it collects resources from the world around you, and you use all these resources to build up your ship, upgrade your little suit. And one of the first moments of the game that I remember was I just land on this planet, and I'm just, all right, cool, I'm just gonna run around, see what goes on, and then my screen starts flashing red, and this bar is just going down and down and down, and I'm like, "Whoa, what's happening?" And then I die. And then it takes me several more tries to realize that I need oxygen. And in order to collect oxygen, I have to collect these little flowers or plants that have oxygen in them in order for me to keep being able to stay alive. And it's the same thing with Astroneer too, where you need to be near oxygen for a while and just keep maintaining your oxygen supply so that you can continue to do all this fun exploration. So I thought those were really fun ways to incorporate science and space into an immersive 3D experience with yourself or with your friends. Oxygen supply so that you can continue to do all this fun exploration. So I thought those were really fun ways to incorporate science and space into an immersive 3D experience with yourself or with your friends.
So, from space back to Earth and the human body. Playfulness and the human body, whether it's ours or someone else's. Oh my goodness. As a kid, I remember all these silly body tricks, hand games, making creatures out of like your fingers, or the classic here's the church, here is the steeple. open the doors and see all the people. That was a thing when I was a kid. So what pictures can your hands create? All that stuff. People jumping to touch a ceiling or a light or whatever, just seeing how far, if they can jump and touch something. Well, all three of us who are on this podcast right now are, shall we say, not the tallest people in the world. And so for some of us, it's kind of like, okay, you do that. If that makes you feel wonderful, go for it. But sometimes there are times when there's a low hanging ceiling and I'll be like, oh, I finally can touch that because my arm, I'm in a medieval castle where people were shorter back in the medieval times, and so now I can touch the top of the corridor or whatever. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Oh my gosh, I remember this when I was a kid, and it still kind of haunts me. And how did that happen? How did we lift that person when we really wouldn't have been able to if we hadn't done this chant and we hadn't done this light as a feather, stiff as a board ritual, that kind of thing? Massages. So just the playfulness of having someone kind of like, touch your body and try and find the points that have stress and work those out. Again, kind of meditative, but also sort of playful. Like, I find myself when I get massages trying to think, okay, where are they going to go next? Are they going to go towards my head? Are they going to go towards my back? When are they going to tell me to flip over? That kind of thing. So I played this little game of trying to figure out what the next place is going to be that they're going to touch and massage and work out. Reiki is very interesting because it's looking at like energy and how it's flowing in your body. And so when I have gone for Reiki treatments, I have challenged myself to think about, can I actually feel the energy moving as the Reiki master is working on me, and just really trying to like concentrate and feel, is there something that's moving around? And then of course, sometimes being affectionate, being playful. We were talking about petting animals, particularly mammals earlier, but maybe with a family member, just being affectionate and like, petting their hair or putting your hand on their back, or with a partner, maybe doing like back scratches or something like that. So playfulness that indicates the closeness that you have with this person. Human body, very, very playful in the way that it moves around and interacts. What do you think, Avery?
Yeah, and when our bodies work too hard or are dealing with bacteria or such, we often get sick. And as Miss Frizzle says in the Magic School Bus episode, when your body is sick, it's telling you to slow down. And in this episode, Ralphie, he's the kid who wears the green shirt and has a red baseball cap worn backwards on his head. And it's funny because even when he's sick in bed in this episode, his red baseball cap is permanently on. Like, it's still with him in the bed.
Nice.
He's trying to like type out this report, but he's so sick and just not able to do it. But he's stressing out because he wants to finish the project and he doesn't want it to be late or whatever. But he just has to stay home. And so Miss Frizzle and classmates come to visit his home. They don't wear masks in this episode, which is, whatever. But they not only visit him and say hi, but they use the magic school bus to shrink down to a microscopic level and then enter his body to figure out why he's sick and what's going on inside. And it's interesting how it starts out with Ralphie being like, "Oh, why do I have to drink this yucky purple medicine?" And the mom's just like, "Well, it's good for you," and blah blah blah. But of course, we're always wondering, why do we have to take this yucky medicine as kids? Good enough, the answer of "it's good for you" is not a good enough response to quell our curiosity as to why. And I think that's something that kids do, a lot as kids. They ask why. And Miss Frizzle's answer to that is science, and let's figure out why so that you can come up with your own answer to that. And the kids basically report to Ralphie's TV straight from inside him, straight from the source, they say. And they're just acting kind of like news reporters and investigators as to, oh, so we're in the bloodstream now. Oh, you're gonna cough us out. Or, oh, look, I found the bacteria that's in your lungs. Oh, look, your white blood cells are fighting off the bacteria. That's good. Oh no, but now they're overwhelmed. What do they do? Oh, antibodies. All right. And then the white blood cells do their jobs too well and then try to eat the school bus. And so Miss Frizzle, while they're just about to get eaten alive, Miss Frizzle's just like, ah, the wonder of the human body. And then the kids just kind of have to figure their ways out of the situation. But even as adults, I mean, we don't really have that much time. We're not given time to rest via our work because we're paid to work and we're not paid to rest. And when we do get sick, that's oftentimes when I am able to actually, relax and play some video games or get extra sleep. But the week that I got my wisdom teeth out this summer, I played so many video games that week, and I was like, wow, this is great. This is what it feels like to have been a kid when I did get sick and I stayed home, and I would always watch Ratatouille because that was just kind of my sick movie. And a lot of the culture nowadays is also promoting mental health days, and not only are physical symptoms a sign of sickness, but mental symptoms can also be a sign that your body needs to slow down. And so it's a very important thing that we are able to take time to rest and play, because play can also be a part of how our body recovers a little bit from working too hard.
I think that play in science and in school is really, really important. And that's why I really like being an anatomy teacher, because I think a lot of what we do is essentially playing and exploring. So, my favorite ways to run my class is really hands on and experiment censored, or not censored, but experiment driven. There we go. And I am always looking at how students can learn more about their body through playing around. So one of the things that I like doing is we do an experiment where we map out touch receptors and seeing how sensitive different parts of the body are in different people by taking a ruler that has two. I actually made this because it's easier than buying a whole bunch of these things called calipers, which can measure distances. So I take a ruler, I take like a little index card and fold it over so that I can hot glue on like a paper clip end, or else you could do a toothpick. And so that I can make a slider that can slide up and down the ruler with a paper clip or toothpick off the side of the slider and then off the end of the ruler. So then as you move up and down the slider, you can move these two pointed ends closer to one another, and it gives you a physical distance of how close or how far something is. So if you're in a group, you have one person look away while someone else touches them with the ruler and the slider starting far away. And there are certain places on your body where you have a whole lot of touch receptors. And so they're very, very sensitive, like on your fingertips, where you're able to discern two separate points at a really close distance. But there are other parts of the body, like your scalp, where you don't have very sensitive touch. You don't have a lot of touch receptors. And so you might have someone touching you with toothpicks that are 2 inches apart, and it might feel like you're only being touched with one particular spot. And so it's kind of fascinating for students to be able to explore and discover on their own how something like touch receptor distribution differs on different parts of the body. I also like bringing in challenges to experiments. So I have these things called hand dynamometers, which are fancy sounding tools where basically you can squeeze this sensor and it registers how many units of force you're able to squeeze with. So how strong you are. And so kids design experiments where they test their grip strength or their pinch strength. And it's fun for them to come up with cool experiments that differ from group to group. Do they want to see, is their right hand stronger than the left hand? And they go and they test a whole bunch of people and record data. One of the experiments that one of my groups came up with last year that was kind of a fun one is they wanted to see if there was any correlation between age and grip strength. And so they tested all their peers, and then they walked around the school and tested us older teachers and people working in the office to figure out what the relationship was. So it's fun because there's a bit of a challenge there, but it's also playful in, hey, what question can we ask that we can use an experiment to answer? Um, there's Stroop tests, which you might have heard of, which are kind of fun neurological tests where I feel like anytime you're learning about yourself, it's really interesting and you want to see, hey, do other people have these same perceptions that I do? So you might have heard of that test where you time how long it takes you to say different colors. So you see red, pink, purple. And then you do it again where instead of seeing a square of different colors, there is a word written in a color. So maybe the word purple is written in green. And so you're trying to say green, but you're reading the word purple. And it takes you longer to say the colors when you're having two executive functions that are competing. And so that's just another fascinating thing. Investigating optical illusions is another example where it's fun to figure out, wait, why is my body doing this weird thing? And it's kind of playful to learn about the body.
Okay, Kristen, I have to ask, what did the students find was the relationship, if any, between age and grip strength?
The problem is we have limited time in class, and so their sample size is really small. So I don't think that any real conclusions could have been drawn on that study when they were, testing 10 young people and 10 older people. So I think that they did find there was a difference, but I would not then be able to go and extrapolate and say, hey, we need to go publish our findings in a scientific journal. So we do definitely talk about sample size and how the experiment, there's, a lot of, I guess, experimental procedures that aren't accurate, but it's more about figuring out how would you do something if we had longer time to actually explore this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Going from a small research project to something that might have meaning across a larger sample size. Yeah, really interesting. Interestingly, in one of my jobs, that I have had some really interesting jobs. One of them was serving as an editorial assistant for the American Journal of Clinical Pathology. And I also, in the same building, was Laboratory Medicine, the journal Laboratory Medicine. And my training is not in science or medicine. I mean, I did have not a minor, but sort of a cluster in science when I was an undergrad. But I suddenly found myself doing this as kind of a day job when I tried to figure out how I was going to do more stuff with theater. And the experiments, looking at what the authors were writing, I would actually challenge myself to read the scientific articles and see how much I could understand. And it was pretty cool to learn a little bit of the language of clinical pathology and of medicine, and just kind of a little bit get immersed in that world and learn some cool stuff about how we make discoveries about the human body and what scientists are actually doing, whether they're helping people in hospital situations or they are at a bench doing science experiments at a bench. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, totally get that. From the human body as we understand it as non-experts to the experts who dedicate their lives to the human body, surgery, doctoring, nursing, research. I will start off with, because this is probably where our listeners think we're going to start off, so let's talk about it. The board game pandemic, which became an absolute sensation during the COVID pandemic. and came out before the pandemic, but just kind of exploded onto the scene. I love Pandemic. I still love just base Pandemic, and my goodness, there are so many different versions of that board game now. So you have a specific role, whether it's researcher or medic or scientist or field operative, and that role in the board gaming community, we call this asymmetric starting situations. And so you have special power that you will use in order to try and treat people who are getting sick around the world, and then discover a cure for the 4 diseases in the base game, and try to either eradicate disease if you can, or just find the cure. As long as you found the cure for all 4, you're golden. There are other games that have you kind of like playing doctor or playing someone who is trying to help out people who are sick. I just got a game called New York Emergency Room, which is kind of quasi like an escape room game where you're getting little folders about different patients and you have different things that you can do. One action means ask them a question about this and give them this kind of medicine and see if it works, that kind of thing. So that's been fun. Rush MD is a game. All right, again, my good friend Matthew, who's my board game buddy, has this Rush MD game where you have to like run around to it's in a hospital, it's in an emergency room, and you flip a sand timer and you've got to go and you've got to like give medicine to this person and flip the sand timer and they'll be okay. And then you go over here and you order a test and you got to flip the sand timer and that kind of thing. And also, being a professor of theater, some of my actors become patients, in quotes. I'm making quotes here with my fingers. Patients for folks who are in residency or in med school and are studying to try and figure out how they talk to patients and how they learn what's going on. And so the actors get a profile that they are supposed to read and memorize and perform. And then they have to improv answers to the questions that the doctors ask them. So I kind of love this because it's putting theater and science together. By the way, there are many, many plays like Copenhagen and all kinds of other things about science. And so science does show up on the stage quite a bit, but this is taking theater off of the stage and into hospitals and into settings. So those are my thoughts on doctors, nurses, surgeons, researchers.
Yeah, there's a lot of also characterization of doctors, whether they're famous or not, but with social media, there are, doctors answering questions, and the more of the personality that people like, the more views that they kind of get. And even with the TV show House MD, though his personality was not very likable, it was still very watchable because of kind of how gruff and, testosterone filled he was or whatever. But I did play the House MD Facebook game back in the 2010s or something with my brother on Facebook, where you would have to, it was just, yeah, just playing, you were House MD with these little patients that you had to fix. But another favorite game of mine related to this was Pandemic, but not the board game. Instead, it was the computer or mobile game. It has Pandemic and then Pandemic 2, and it's an outbreak game about infecting the world. So you are the disease with the goal of killing off the entire population of the world. And to do this, you have to constantly evolve, avoid detection, and spread yourself to more victims and to increase your deadliness. And boy, oh boy, this was a really fun game to play a ton because you don't really see any bodies in here. All you see is just a map of the world, their airports and their ship bases and all the other little government centers or whatever, and you just see airplanes and ships going around the world because that's where the people are. And then you select, do you want to be a bacteria or do you want to be a virus? Do you want to inflict coughing? Oh, or do you want to eventually inflict kidney infection? Because that kidney infection was one of the top killers. But if you choose the kidney infection path too soon, people are going to start dying too soon and they're not going to infect enough people. And then, thus, they're going to come up with a cure too soon. And then that's going to be the end of your pandemic. So, the balance of increasing contagion and increasing deadliness was a very, very fun thing to figure out. And there are so many games where you would increase your contagion to the level of infecting the entire world, and then you would start being a more noticeable thing, and then the cure would come too late. And so yeah, that was definitely. I also re-downloaded that during the pandemic as well, the COVID pandemic too, to cope with the situation, or also to re-enjoy a different perspective of infection, because when we deal with things in real life that are too stressful, sometimes we turn to play and games in order to deal with a different perspective of it that's not as dangerous.
So I actually have a board game contribution here, which is surprising for me since
Yay!
I feel like I don't have as many board games in my pocket as you guys do. But there is a game called Organ Attack, and it's a card game. And my kids used to love to play that game. And the goal of the game is to remove your opponent's organs. So there would be cards like, you have gastritis, and if someone hits you with gastritis, it attacks your stomach. And I think you have to have like 2 hits on your organ to remove that organ. So then somebody else comes with like H. pylori, which is like ulcers, and they can attack you and take your stomach out. And then you can fight back with vaccines. And then there's like immunity booster cards, and it has really funny like cartoon pictures of all of the organs. So that was always a fun game. I had a couple of extra ones that I would keep at my workplace. So if students finished something early, like, oh, okay, well, go get an organ attack and keep yourself busy playing organ attack. I also love there was a fun Flash game, and I don't remember it now that you can't do Flash anymore, but there was a game where you would perform surgeries, and I remember one sticking out to me that I thought was really cool was like a C-section, so cesarean section surgery, where you would cut through the layers of the abdomen. That I did not do this at work, but I remember like, hey kids, like my own kids, like, hey, let's play this cool game and let's deliver a baby. Oh, and there was one where you would think that it wouldn't be the worst one, but the toenail removal surgery was the worst.
Oh
Okay,
gosh.
okay, judging from all your faces, you do think that that would be the worst. So, yeah, I don't even remember what these games were called because they were powered by Flash, but they were really cool. Something that is still around that I do have my anatomy students play is there a blood typing game, and it's actually called Blood Typing Nobel Prize, so you can search for it, and the goal of the game is to help teach people about blood transfusions and universal donors and universal acceptors. So you play the game and you learn what blood type your patient is by doing blood typing tests, and you mix little vials and you have to say, oh, this person must be type A and they must be A negative or O positive. And then once you figure out what blood type that patient is based on the little vials that you mix, and there's all sorts of sounds that I'm picturing in my head that just make the game. And once you figure out their blood type, then you go on to the transfusion part. And there are a whole bunch of bags of blood lined up that you can drag on over to the IV line. So if you know if someone is A negative, you have to figure out, oh, there's type O positive blood here. Can they get that? Can they get A negative blood? And you figure out what bags of blood they could receive and you drag it over. And if you're correct, it makes like the funny noise, like they yell, oh, yes. And if you're wrong, then they scream. And the funny part is when I have a classroom of students playing this and you just hear like a chorus of like, ah, and you know that the patient is like turning green on their screen. So it's pretty funny what people have come up with to help also educate at the same time as playing games. So that's my 2 cents on gaming. I'm happy to contribute.
Yay.
Thanks, Kristen. Final thoughts. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Let me start with a quote from the great naturalist John Muir, who said, "Any fool can destroy trees. They cannot run away. And if they could, they would still be destroyed, chased and hunted down as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark hides, branching horns, or magnificent bull backbones." What are our responsibilities, right? What are our responsibilities? How does play teach us about our responsibilities when we go to the tide pools? How does play teach us about those creatures belong in the ocean? They do not belong brought up to the street and put on the sidewalk to see what will happen. Our responsibilities in terms of what is our blood type, and could we donate? I myself am O positive. So my goodness, you two, the Red Cross contacts me a lot and says, we need your blood cells right now. What are our responsibilities? And sometimes stories about science or playful things about science seem like a desire for power and control over nature. Nature is big. Nature is big. Nature is powerful. Nature can be dangerous. And so, how much do we know about it? And with our own knowledge, how much can we influence it? The classic story of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's classic story of if we could resurrect flesh and if we could create a creature out of flesh that was no longer living, but we could recharge it, should we? What should we do? Jurassic Park, of course, is one of the most recent ones, right? Should we? What are our responsibilities in terms of creatures that have, as the Jeff Goldblum character says, dinosaurs had their shot and they were selected for extinction. I was being Jeff Goldblum there. That's my best Jeff Goldblum impression, you guys. So what are we supposed to do? How does play teach us about that? Whether it's kids or whether it's us as adults, and science fiction and trying to understand what are the warnings with science fiction, what are the opportunities, and what are the responsibilities. And a whole bunch of play, I think, explores that. I think of the marches for science that existed during the Trump administration, when there was a lot of conversation about, can we trust science? Can we trust scientists? There was a great, not great as in it was good, but great as in it was big, a sort of look at the intersection of science and politics, and huge questions about how those two influenced each other. And so there were folks who were absolutely fed up with science being thrown out the window in terms of politics and decision making. And folks got out there and they held up signs that said, trust science, trust scientists. And it was a moment that was really like nothing I had seen before. And when I was a kid, science was everything. Science and technology was part of America. It was part of who we were as a society, and our gains and our successes, whether it was reaching the moon or whether it was developing vaccines, whatever it was, suddenly that was kind of woven into the fabric of the country was being questioned, and people were having to push back. Like, who would have thought that we would ever have to defend science? But in that moment, it kind of became a thing. And one more quote from the great Neil deGrasse Tyson. I love this guy. He really breaks down concepts and makes them understandable. And here he is talking about Carl Sagan, the great Carl Sagan from when I was a kid. He hosted, I think it was on PBS. It was either, I think it was just called Carl Sagan's Science, if I'm remembering correctly. But here's what deGrasse Tyson said. Carl Sagan spoke fluently between biology and geology and astrophysics and physics. If you move fluently across those boundaries, you realize that science is everywhere. we're surrounded by it. So those were my final thoughts. Avery, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just thought you brought up a lot of really great points about the line between being an observer or contributor to science and nature around us, kind of like with Wingspan, where we're just visiting birds and letting birds visit us, versus where we want to be in control and be the force of change among everything else, whether we want to be the doctors stopping a plague or be the actual plague itself. That there's a lot of room for us to explore the nature of power and control, and also trust, as you say, because I think the reason that we teach science in schools is that there's not really a way to trust something or a concept, trust for something to be true until you trust the actions that it takes, the phenomenon that you observe from it, but also your own brain and the conclusions that you might be able to garner from that. But also, like you said, there are experts who dedicate their lives to doing that. And so what is the reason that you can't trust them for other reasons? And then yeah, I'm just really grateful that I've had so many opportunities for science to be a part of my life. Really grateful for my 6th grade science teacher who exploded a pumpkin every Halloween, because there's also like the playful ways that we get children interested in science is also really important too.
I think it's interesting that you were talking about trust in the scientific community and how people are experts and they've dedicated their lives to exploring very, very specific topics that take years and years and years and are so focused that now I think with our ability to get information all of the time from everywhere, people maybe confuse what it means to be an expert because they believe that they can do a little bit of research without having been trained in what does it look like to be critical, and feel like they are then experts on the topic from a deep dive that they did on the internet. And I think that that's kind of interfering with our ability to trust science because we feel like, oh, well, I can do it just as well, when there is a whole lot of training and years of study that have gone into making someone an expert and not just reading something that could be biased. And that's just something we have to keep in mind. I also really love talking about how science is everywhere. I went out to lunch with one of my friends and he was talking about how much he loves chemistry, and he was telling me, to anything in this room and I'm going to tell you how it relates to chemistry, which I thought was just so funny that I have a friend that loves chemistry that much that he wants to talk about it at a lunch that we're going out to that doesn't have anything to do with talking about chemistry. I recently went on a symposium, a climate educator symposium, and we were in Anza-Borrego, and we had one of the state parks rangers leading us, and he said that his favorite part about his job is he feels like he is his 10-year-old self just getting to play all of the time.
Oh.
And I thought that that is just such a nice feeling to feel like my job is I get to be a kid. And I just love thinking that science is out there everywhere, just like you said.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen, for being with us on this very special podcast episode. It could not have been as in-depth and insightful as it has been without you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kristen, for joining us and sharing everything that's going on in your life, your childhood, and with your students. And our listeners, thank you for listening. And we'll see you, or maybe not see you, but we'll speak to you in our next episode.
Yes, through these very magical sound waves that somehow end up from our day today to you in the future via the strange device in your possession. This has been Powered by Play with Avery and Drew. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you can support us online at Ko-fi. That is ko-fi.com/poweredbyplay. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.